whole issue of what do people talk about, the one-state solution, the two-state solution. What are they talking about? And I'm going to do a little bit of the history of this debate as well, because it has changed over the decades. I think it's important, not because people have to, in order to oppose the genocide in Gaza, have to take a stand on what the ultimate solution should look like. And in fact, for most Americans, it's not our place to determine what the ultimate solution looks like. In the end, that's for the people who live in Palestine. But, and by that I mean the Jews and the Palestinians together to come up with the ultimate solution. Nevertheless, it is important if one is protesting an unjust situation, and I don't just mean, you don't need any theory to be against the genocide. You just need to be a human being, right? If you're not appalled by what's going on in Gaza right now, there is something wrong with your personality structure. That's my view. However, insofar as one thinks Zionism is unjust and wrong and the like, well, it helps to have some idea of what a just situation would be like. And that's why it's worth engaging in the question that is constantly being debated among various political alignments on the Israel-Palestine issue on this one-state, two-state thing. So, first of all, let me just say it's not a binary thing. It's not you choose one state or you choose two states. Either one of those options can mean lots of different things and has meant different things over the history of this conflict. So to give you some idea, let's go back to the period under the British Mandate between and 1947 when the UN voted to partition Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state. During that period, there were a group of, actually, those of you who came to the talk the other day about the history of Zionism, this is a group I actually should have included and left out. But in Palestine, during that period, that crucial period between 1917 and 1947, there was a group, a Jewish group, called Brit Shalom, which means Covenant of Peace. And it was one of its most prominent spokespeople was Judah Magnus, who was the president of Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And their view, they more aligned with what you may remember, those of you who were here on Monday, I talked about there being a kind of Zionism that was called cultural Zionism as opposed to political Zionism. So the Brit Shalom people were in this cultural Zionist camp, and what they wanted in Palestine, by the way, there were very few Palestinians involved in this group, and I don't know, even though today they look like the good guys, in many ways they were for their time, nevertheless, there wasn't a lot of buy-in from the Palestinian community for this. Nevertheless, what they wanted was what they called a binational state. So that's one version of what's sometimes called the one-state solution, is have a binational state. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is instead of the principle of just one person, one vote, and a complete sort of secular civic notion of citizenship, which is, formally speaking, what we have in the United States, right? What your nationality, your background, and is not supposed to make any difference to the way in which you participate in the political process in this country. Now, whether it does, in fact, is another story, but at least on paper, it's not supposed to. And that's one version of a one-state solution. But the other version, this binational version, said, look, there are two peoples. And this is a very crucial idea, peoples. What is a people? A people is some collective or group that shares enough in common that they want to exercise political sovereignty among themselves in some way. These are the people I'm doing my political project with. And if you recognize, you say, well, look, there are two peoples in this one land, Palestinian and Jews. Forget about how the Jews got there for the moment. Just let's, for the moment, assume they're there. Then it might make sense to say, well, you can't just have one person, one vote, because since there has been tension and conflict and bitterness between these two peoples, it might make sense to say you don't want either of the two groups to ever worry about what happens if they become the minority. So what you do is you set up a kind of here's just one version of it, is you set up a bicameral legislature that's, as it were, the Jewish parliament and the Palestinian parliament, and they exercise authority over certain areas that have to do with their own communities. And then for things that involve both communities, the single national state, things like defense, a lot of economic policy and the like, they have to agree. Each side would have something like veto power. So it can't be outvoted. So everyone would have to agree. So binationalism is, in fact, has been around, as I said, since the 20s at least, 20s and 30s. It was pushed by this group that were on the kind of left, most progressive wing of the Zionist movement, the Brit Shalom group. But they were marginalized. By the 30s, they were just not a real political factor anymore. And the Zionist movement, the political Zionist movement, was headlong rushing into the idea of just being a Jewish state. So anyway, so that's one idea, is that a single state can be secular, civic, in the way that, say, the United States is at the moment. I could say at the moment, too, because you never know what's going to happen. But also, it could also be binational. And in fact, a lot of dissidents against American and Israeli policy, even after the founding of the State of Israel in the 50s and 60s, still pushed this idea of binationalism. I first encountered it when I was reading Noam Chomsky, the book he wrote, I think it was back in the late 60s, early 70s, called Peace in the Middle East. He advocated binationalism. All right, so it has a long pedigree. Okay, so that's the differences in the idea of one state. Now, another thing I just want to say about one state is, at the moment, people act often, especially in the mainstream media, as if we don't have a solution yet. That is, should we go for one state? Should we go for two states? And a lot of people, especially in the last decade or so, have been emphasizing that, by the way, we do have a situation that can count as one or two states, and that is we have what's called a one-state reality. At the moment, there is one single sovereign authority that exercises complete coercive authority. Sometimes, by the way, let me just back up. What do we mean by a state anyway? And I know some of you are bound to be anarchists and don't like the very idea of a state. That's a different discussion. We won't do that today. Those of you who were here Monday remember Rachel Weber chiding me about that. She and I disagree, but all right. Anyway, but what does it mean to be a state? Well, one essential ingredient of what it is to be a state is to have a monopoly on coercive power. It's where the buck stops when it comes to exercising authority and power. And it's called having sovereignty. So sometimes you'll see the word who's sovereign, and sometimes you'll also see the expression of territorial rights. Those have to do with who's in charge, ultimately, right? There can be local control for some things, but in the end, there's one authority that has a monopoly. Well, today, that monopoly is held by the Israeli government from the river to the sea, right? I mean, I know they hate us talking about from the river to the sea, but boy, that's what they do. They exercise authority from the river to the sea. And in that one state reality, they have many different categories of Jewish citizens, non-Jewish citizens, and then non-citizens. And that one state that right now has authority from the river to the sea has been deemed by at least 3 major human rights organizations, one of them the very well-known Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, have called it an apartheid state. And in fact, B'Tselem's document on this, which is worth looking at, basically says a regime of Jewish supremacy and then uses the phrase from the river to the sea. So that's what we have today. So when people say the one-state solution is ridiculous, it could never happen, one answer is we've got that right now. It's just a horrible state. It's an apartheid state, an unjust state. All right. And when we say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, part of what we mean is we're going to undo the institutions of that state. Okay. All right. But now what about this two-state idea? Here too, boy, it depends on who you talk to and what they mean by that. So after the 67 war, so I can't remember if Chomsky's book about binationalism was written before the 67 war or right after. I'm sure one of you is going to look it up on your phone and tell me immediately. That's why I'm getting out of teaching. It's constantly being corrected by students in the classroom with their phones. It's hard to take. Anyway, but after the Six-Day War in 1967, so I'm sure most of you know this, but just so we're all on the same page, in 1948, during the war that caused the Nakba, that involved the expelling of about 750,000 Palestinians, the Zionist movement took over 78% of Palestine, even though they were only allotted 55% by the UN, but they took over 78%. And that became de facto what people mean by Israel proper. And in fact, there was never a peace agreement, but the borders of that 78% got called the Green Line. These were armistice lines, ceasefire lines that were demarcated in early 1949. So from then on, well, what happened? What was going on in the West Bank and Gaza? Well, the West Bank was ruled by Jordan. That's why it's called the West Bank of the Jordan River, but the Jordanian government ruled there. In fact, they gave citizenship to everybody in the West Bank. The Egyptians ruled the Gaza Strip, did not give citizenship to the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And so the main issue about Palestinian rights had very little to do at the time about the West Bank and Gaza. It had mostly to do with the Palestinians who remained inside Israel and then the rights of the Palestinian refugees who had been kicked out. That's where the focus was. But then in 1967, Israel expanded its borders, took over the entire area from the river to the sea, the entire West Bank, Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip. And at that point, and they took control of it, and they were officially an occupying power, which is a category understood in international law. The Geneva Conventions govern occupation and what an occupying power can do and can't do. And almost immediately, the Israelis violated, specifically the Fourth Geneva Convention, by sending settlers into the West Bank, and eventually in the Gaza Strip too. But there's always been more concern about holding on to the West Bank because if you go back in Jewish history and biblical history, that the West Bank is actually where most of the stuff that one reads about in the Hebrew Bible happened, not in the coastal area of Palestine, where in fact the ancient Israelites didn't really live. So at any rate, there was, and in fact, within a day or two after conquering Jerusalem, one of the first things the Israelis did is they completely razed to the ground an entire neighborhood that abutted the Wailing Wall, which is by tradition the last wall that was standing from the ancient temple. And they got rid of an entire neighborhood so that they could have a plaza in front. That was a war crime. That was a violation of international law. That happened either the day after or 2 or 3 days after they conquered Jerusalem. So once that project happened, of course, after the war, immediately there started to be some concern about, well, what's going to happen with the West Bank and Gaza? The Israelis were not about to give citizenship to the couple of million new Palestinians that were under their authority because, well, if they gave them citizenship, they could outvote the Jews and then it wouldn't be a Jewish state anymore. So they couldn't do that. On the other hand, they didn't want to give the land back, and so they encouraged this kind of ambiguous idea that it was occupation and we're willing to negotiate. Again, that was 1967. How many years ago was that? Over 50, right? I think 57 years. My math is right. All right, and they've been maintaining that situation ever since. So one of the more radical ideas that came out of the progressive movement and the movement for Palestinian rights in the 1970s was the two-state solution. That was at the time the progressive idea, and there were sort of two planks to that. I remember that I was involved in various groups in the 1980s, and we had two things we were pushing. One, that Israel and the United States should recognize the Palestine Liberation Organization. The PLO, which I'm sure you've all heard of, in the 80s and 90s played the role that Hamas does today. The horrible terrorist organization that you cannot even talk to, right? God forbid you should even have a conversation with them, right? That was the stand of the United States and Israel at that time. In fact, Jimmy Carter's first UN ambassador, Andrew Young, had to be fired because the Israelis had a recording of him being at a social occasion at which there was a PLO official. And the very fact of being in the same room with a PLO official was grounds for dismissing him. That's what the attitude toward the PLO was. So anyway, during that period, people said, no, look, here's what should happen. The West Bank and Gaza, now that they've been liberated, as it were, from Jordan and Egypt, they should be made a state, a Palestinian state for the people who live there. And again, that was a very radical idea. Everyone was, Israel was opposed to it, the United States was opposed to it. And I should say, when they talked about that, what they had in mind was a fully sovereign state. Okay? In fact, there were some Israeli officials who, right after the Six-Day War, had this idea, look, we could actually solidify our position in Israel, make peace with the Arab states, if we just let the Palestinians have their state in the West Bank and Gaza, right? And indeed, who knows what history would have been like after that, had that happened. But the euphoria, you almost might call it drunken euphoria, that Israel experienced over this incredible military victory in 1967 made those kinds of pragmatic, let's not even talk about justice, just pragmatic kinds of arguments, they just didn't take. Everyone was just completely obsessed with incorporating the West Bank. And Gaza, that was another story. But anyway, so that was the two-state solution at that time. Then the first Intifada happened in the late 80s, and all of a sudden people realized, wait a second, the occupation thing isn't working. People aren't just going along with it. So we've got to do some accommodation, and that led to the Oslo Agreement that many people, I'm sure, have heard about, which was supposed to eventually a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza. And that's the effort that the United States got behind and the international consensus got behind. But it's really important to say, well, okay, what did you have in mind by a second state? What Palestinian rights supporters at the time had in mind was, as I said, a fully sovereign state. It has complete control over its borders, its air, it has a military, a state like any other state. Israel and the United States, however, said, oh, yeah, we're for a Palestinian state. However, it has to be demilitarized. Israel has to have control over the airspace, right? And all of a sudden, all these conditions were put in. And indeed, maybe people have heard of the famous Camp David meeting that happened that President Clinton organized in 2000 with Yasser Arafat and Ehud Barak, who was Prime Minister of Israel at the time, and they were going to come up with a final settlement. And the way the media spun it was Arafat just refused what was often called Israel's generous offer. That was I put that in quotes because that's the term people used. Well, there's a really good book by a guy named Clayton Swisher, and the title of the book is, I'm missing it for the moment. Anyway, he went into just what we know of those Oslo agreements. And one of the interesting things is, in that agreement, Israel was to be given a 25-year lease on the Jordan Valley, which is the most fertile area of the West Bank. If you look at the West Bank, there are hills that go down the spine, and on the eastern side of those hills, between those hills and the Jordan River, is the Jordan Valley. And Israel was going to get to occupy that for anywhere from 15 to 25 years. That's not sovereignty. Having your oppressor have troops in your country, that's not sovereignty. So this idea of a second state, a Palestinian state, what they're talking about now, that Biden is in favor of, it's all of this ridiculous, well, actually, there is a very good analogy for what they have in mind. South Africa, during the period of apartheid, allowed certain African groups to have their own states. They were called Bantustans, right? And they had officially a certain kind of sovereignty, but of course, South Africa actually ruled over them. This is what, when you hear Democratic politicians and American politicians, and even some Israeli politicians on the so-called left, talk about a Palestinian state, that's what they mean. In the end, some kind of Bantustan, something that does not have full sovereignty. So one thing is, when people say they're for two states, one question you have to ask is, well, what do you mean by two states? What kind of a state are you have in mind that Palestinians can have? All right, so that's one issue. Let me now talk about why the two-state solution, even the more full-fledged two-state position, the kind that the progressive Palestinian rights people had in mind in the 70s and 80s, why that solution has now gone out of favor. And the main reason is the occupation. Well, two reasons, but that's the main reason. That is, what everyone is saying today is, back in the 80s, even back in the 90s, it was possible to imagine dividing Israel from the West Bank and Gaza and creating a single state. It would have been difficult. I mean, you've seen the map. You see Israel is in between the West Bank and Gaza. There would have to be some kind of strip of land that the Palestinian state would have authority over, right? And there are all kinds of difficulties about that, but it did look possible. There were a lot of settlers in the West Bank and in Gaza, but they could be removed. I mean, Israel had the power to do that. When they wanted to remove them in Gaza in 2005, they did. They could have done that in the West Bank. But that was 30 years ago. In fact, I remember the last time I actually was there, I was there in 1992. And I remember when you were in East Jerusalem, it was pretty clearly Palestinian. And you walk to West Jerusalem, you can tell it's Israeli. There was really a clear demarcation. But over the last 30 years, the number of settlements and settlers that have infiltrated the West Bank has gotten to the point where the very idea that, one, you could remove them all, we're talking about 700,000. I mean, it's a huge number. And by the way, sometimes you'll see figures about how many settlers in the West Bank. It's usually a false figure because they don't count the Israeli residents of East Jerusalem. But East Jerusalem is occupied territory, even though Israel annexed it. So all Israeli citizens living in East Jerusalem are settlers. All right. So you have to count them in too. Well, once that happened, it became clear that any kind of actual division between these two states is impossible. Now, first of all, that was the plan. Israel set out with its settlement policy. They wanted to occupy the land, they wanted to take it over, but in particular, one of the things they wanted to do was make it impossible to implement a two-state solution. So many of those governments would claim they're in favor of it, but then they were pursuing policies that directly undermined the possibility of having a second Palestinian state. Today, it would be absurd. The size of the settlements, the amount of integration, and also one thing that was happening at that time that's really important, and this was pointed out by a scholar who and an activist that I highly recommend you read if you haven't, a man named Jeff Halper, who helped found the Israeli Committee Against Home Demolitions, and now, I'll speak about that in just a minute, is spearheading the One Democratic State campaign. He's an American who moved to Israel back in the early 70s, and he's been a fighter for Palestinian rights ever since, getting more radical over the years, not surprising. But I remember meeting him in the 90s, and he was a two-state advocate. He really thought that that was probably the best solution. But I remember him giving a lecture, and he showed a map of Israel and the West Bank, and he said, look, you have to understand the kind of road construction, building construction, all sorts of infrastructure that Israel is pursuing. And one thing to understand about it is that Israel is consciously moving the spine of the country from the western coastal area to the West Bank, to the edge of the West Bank. And by doing that, they're integrating both sides of the Green Line into a single socioeconomic political unit, and making it therefore impossible to have any kind of genuine sovereign distinction here. So that's one reason people gave up on the two-state solution, is basically there is only one state now, and there really only can be. But the second reason is that I think there's been more emphasis now. There used to be emphasis on this in the 50s, but now there's more emphasis again on the situation of Palestinian citizens of Israel. Because even though they have citizenship rights, they can vote, and they're certainly not oppressed to the degree that the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are. Nevertheless, they are a second class, and actually I should say third class, because it's the Jews from the Middle East, they're the second class. But anyway, they are an oppressed minority. Adalah, which is a organization, a Palestinian human rights organization in the area, has documented 60 different laws that Israel has on its books that discriminate against Palestinians, or I should say against non-Jews. 20% of Israel's population now, of its citizenry, I'm not talking about the West Bank and Gaza, 20% are now Palestinian citizens of Israel. That is higher than the percentage of black citizens in the United States. Yet, it's institutionalized in Israel that they have second-class citizenship, right? So, for instance, it's considered an okay thing for the government to have as its policy that there always be a Jewish majority. The government has certain kinds of policies that they sometimes call Judaizing an area, like the Galilee and the Negev. Now, as racist as the United States is, it would be hard to imagine, right? The problem is everything keeps getting worse, so who knows? At least 5 years ago, it would have been hard to imagine an American official saying we need to whiteify an area, right?
Sorry.
Right? That's right. I mean, they might think it.
No, they totally did. They totally. That's not new at all.
I know.
You to say that that's like 5 years ago, like that's like far-fetched is disconnected. It feels.
Okay. Anyway, Nevertheless, that is the official policy of the State of Israel. Okay, so one reason then that people have thought about, look, there has to be just one state, was, as I said, these two reasons. Finally, let me say there still is an issue about what that one state would look like. And there are people who actually feel like binationalism would still make sense. And there are others that are opposed to it. And these are all people that I think are within the Palestinian rights movement. And there are just, let me end, I know I'm over my time. There are just a couple of things that I think we have to be clear about. One thing is, though I agree that Israel is a settler colonial, there's no doubt it counts to my mind as a settler colonial enterprise. Nevertheless, there is one difference between, say, Israel and, say, Algeria or other places, and that is that the settler colonialists, the Jews who live in Israel, don't have another country to go back to. The point is they're not going to leave. They're not going anywhere. They're 7 million. They are economically strong. They're not going anywhere. Just like the whites of South Africa didn't go anywhere. I mean, some left, but there's still a white community. The Jews in Israel are not going anywhere. What does that mean is that whatever solution we have come up with, it's got to be one that all the people in that area can live with. There is no such thing as completely imposing a solution that one of these two peoples cannot live with. That is just going to be a recipe for disaster. So one idea people have is, let's go back to this binational idea of Jews say they want a place where they can feel safe. Well, if they had their own institutions within a joint Israel-Palestine, where they could veto anything that would be a threat to the Jewish community, just like the Palestinian, institutions could veto anything that would be a threat to theirs. And then there was common authority exercised for the things that would need to be common authority. That is still within the one state idea, and it is one that I think people will take seriously. As I said, I'm not going to actually say I don't think it's up to us to say this is the right solution, because this is something people there have to work out themselves. But then there's also those who argue for a secular democratic state where the government is completely civic and non-national, except in the sense of having sovereign authority. And in many ways, this has been the program of the Palestinian parties that have organized among Palestinian citizens of Israel for many years. They call it, the slogan that they have is, let's make Israel the state of all its citizens. Because it isn't. It's a state now that belongs to its Jewish citizens, not all its citizens. Let's make Israel a state that belongs to all its citizens. What would that mean? It would mean removing all legislation, all institutional formations that in any way privilege one group over the other. And in this case, it would be privileging Jews over Palestinians. Now that is, I think, that is what I think most people now have in mind when they say they're in favor of one state. In fact, that's how I interpret the phrase, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, meaning Palestine will be a state that is the state of all its citizens, both Jews and Palestinians. And if people want to have, as it were, social, political, cultural, well, not political, but social, cultural organizations that specifically speak to their own background, whether Jewish, Palestinian, or even on religious grounds, they would be free to do that, but they wouldn't have the character of state-authorized institutions. The state would be independent of any of that. Now, as a person, my own predilections in terms of my political philosophy, is to say that that is the way every state should be. Every state should be one based on civic citizenship, in which you are a citizen of the state and you have the same, you come to the political sphere and participate on an equal basis with everybody else. And then in your own life, of course, you associate with who you want to. You join a synagogue or a mosque or a church, that, or neither. We atheists have to be accommodated too. So that, to me, would fit my views the best. However, a lot of people say, well, there still is, even if we get to a point where the Israelis are negotiating in good faith and we actually could reach something like a solution of this sort, still, it might be better for some time to have this kind of binational character. I myself think that kind of question, when we get into the weeds at that point, we are talking about something that the people there have to figure out for themselves. It is not something for us to dictate. But anyway, I just want to emphasize again, the two-state thing, while it may have made sense at one point in history, it's just a non-issue now. And anyone who brings it up is basically saying, oh, I'm on the side of keeping negotiations going ad infinitum while Israel takes over more and more land and kicks out more and more people, because that's all the two-state solution is right now. It's a tactic, nothing more than that. But within the one-state idea, I do think there are differences, and some of them give more emphasis on the notion of collective rights, some of them more on the emphasis on individual rights. And I think those are actually debates that can be healthy.
Justice in Palestine, faculty for Justice in Palestine. We're using the space to also to educate. I mean, it's so important right now we are demonstrating, we're We'll take a second. Take a moment. In terms of the practical reality of the possibilities, so many are saying it's a utopian vision of how the constant expansion of the settlements, and really the ways they allow settlers to just go on rampages. Many Palestinians are disheartened. Is it possible to live side by side? Many Israelis see the hope, see the vision. Is it possible, especially with how the settlers in particular relate to these proposed solutions?
Yeah, right now we have a settler-dominated government in Israel. It wasn't, many people who look at this right-wing government say, oh, the good old days when Labor was in charge. Well, Labor is what brought us to this situation. The Labor Party, not Labor, but the Labor Party in Israel. So it's always been a problem. But right now, there is not just a settler colonial institution. We now have a kind of fascist character going on in the country. I mean, where there is just amazing levels of hate and hostility. I'm sure a lot of you have seen a lot of the social media posts coming out of Israel, and the way, just the disgusting things that are being said about Palestinians and the people in Gaza. It really turns your stomach. And you realize, when there's a poll recently that said 2/3 of Israeli Jews are opposed to letting any aid into Gaza whatsoever until all the hostages are out. So basically they're saying starve 2.5 million people. Okay, and that is a popular opinion in Israel right now. How do Palestinians feel? Well, as Huang just said, look, they are under attack everywhere. And by the way, Palestinian citizens of Israel, again, not as bad as the West Bank, and that's not as bad as Gaza. Nothing is as bad as Gaza right now. But nevertheless, they are under attack. I'm forgetting the name. Maybe one of you can help me remember the Palestinian professor at Hebrew University that was arrested. Her last name is something Kevorkian, and I just totally blocked on her name. You can find it. Anyway, she just tweeted support for aid to Gaza and an opposition to the genocide. Something just standard free speech, and she was arrested by the Israelis, eventually let go, suspended by the university. She could be rearrested at any point. A lot of Palestinian citizens of Israel are saying things like, I don't dare leave the house. Right? Everyone's talking about the safety of Jewish students on campus, right? Well, the safety of Palestinian citizens of Israel is a real issue because there are lots of people out there who are just seething, and the police don't protect Palestinian citizens. Isn't that surprising? Anyway, so yeah, there is incredible bitterness. In that situation, the idea of a kind of kumbaya moment where the two peoples come together and form a state together does seem utopian. But here's the thing. First, as I said, we have a one-state reality, and it's apartheid. So if you think there's no solution but the current thing, you're basically saying we just have to go along with apartheid and just let the Israelis do what they want. So obviously that can't stay. And then the question is, well, how do you get over this? And of course, this would be a long process, but I just want to finally end with this one thing I mentioned earlier about Jeff Halper. So Jeff Halper and a number of Palestinian partners, both citizens of Israel and residents of the occupied territories, have been working on a movement they call the One Democratic State Campaign. Halper has a book out called Decolonizing Israel, and I very highly recommend people read that book. There's an article in the blog Mondoweiss that came out a few years ago where Halper outlines this idea of the One Democratic State Campaign. And his idea is that there needs to be one state that is democratic, that has everyone has full and equal political rights, but that the state does something to support institutions that would speak to the national aspirations of both Jews and Palestinians. How exactly it would work is complicated, right? And they don't have it all worked out yet, but they do have a platform. And one of the most important aspects of their platform, one of the things that can try to address the kind of issues that Wang just brought up, is that he understands that it's not just a matter of forming a new state structure, but he says the first thing that has to happen is Palestine has to be decolonized. And what that means is that you have to, from the root, uproot all of the institutions that have a colonial character and really instill genuine equality. It may sound like a utopian vision in some ways, and right now, while this genocide's going on, of course, that's something that has to wait until we stop the genocide. But in the long run, if you're going to have 15 million people or so living between the river and the sea, not at war, this is the only thing that's going to be possible. This is the only way forward at this point. And if Jews who wanted a Jewish state see a great loss in not having their state anymore, well, they can blame the Israeli government that made that impossible. Because back in the 80s, it could have happened if they just would have agreed. You have a question?
Yeah, it seems like...
Well, to a certain extent, by doing what we're all doing, and I am not someone who knows how to manipulate the levers of political power in ways that bring something together. But let me just say something about what you call the right-wing character of Hamas. And not that I'm not going to disagree with you about that. Hamas is not an organization that I share any politics with, by and large. They are a resistance and a liberation organization, and they're a social and political movement. I mean, I remember I had a discussion in class, in my political philosophy class, a week after October 7th, and somebody said, but isn't Hamas a terrorist organization? And I said, look, terrorism is a tactic. It's not a state of being. People aren't just essentially terrorists. Every organized movement in the world, I shouldn't say every, many, right, and most organized movements in the world, including states, have employed terrorism as a tactic. The United States did that all the time. So Israel has done that throughout its history. So yes, there is that. My view about the terrorism is, look, you give people a stake, you give them something to lose, you give people an actual recognition and a chance to forge something new, they'll abandon the terrorism. The terrorism is there because no other alternative is seen. I mean, one of the things that was the case before October 7th was everyone thought Hamas was just completely contained, and they had no problem. And now we can go ahead and get, relations with Saudi Arabia, the Abraham Accords, and Palestinians can just be forgotten about. And so it really is the case that terrorism has often been resorted to when it looked like there was no other way to get anyone's attention. Now, why is an Islamic organization right now, both in Palestine and in other parts of the Arab world, why are they the ones that are the most politically active? Why is that the movement for Arab liberation? Why is it centered right now in the Islamic movements? Well, here's one reason. Because secular Arab nationalism, which was extremely strong throughout the Middle East in the 50s and 60s, was definitively defeated by Western powers, in particular Israel. In fact, when people ask why does the United States support Israel anyway, one answer that Noam Chomsky has given, he says, well, look, in 1967, the Israeli military defeated the hopes of secular Arab nationalism by humiliating the militaries of Syria and Egypt. And the United States thought, wow, these guys are on our side, right? They're keeping this nationalism down. So when secular nationalism was defeated, it's not surprising that people moved on to a different form. Now, how you get a progressive, what we consider a socially and politically progressive movement going in an area where it doesn't seem to right now have a lot of following, I think that's hard, but one of the first things we have to do is create an atmosphere where people aren't killing each other. And right now, the only way to do that is stop Israel and enforce on them through BDS and on an international level, enforce on them that genuine negotiations with Palestinians, including Hamas, anyone who is representative, has to take place. And I believe that once we start that process, then of course other kinds of movements and differences on both sides are going to come out. And that's when, as progressives, just like in this country, you've got to do your organizing and get your ideas out there. I can't predict if that will succeed. You never know.
This is so great. We're going to keep it, if you don't mind, we're going to keep it going. Can you do it?
Oh, I can stay here all day.
Great. We've got a few. I'm going to take Stack. If you just, I'll just quote it really quickly. If I can just also just intervene. The label terrorism. Again, as Joe just noted. I mean, it's applied when you don't have a state. I mean, when it's a government, you have sovereignty and you have an army and a state. It's not called terrorism. Who decides the label terrorism? often we're told when we compare the movement, BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, modeled after the movement against apartheid South Africa, to bring that down, they said, well, where's your Nelson Mandela? Nelson Mandela was on the terrorist watch list, until 2008. 2008, 5 years before his death. 2008. 1986, the apartheid regime declared the ANC a terrorist group. And Ronald Reagan followed suit, designating them a terrorist group. So it's the US government and these repressive regimes, it was apartheid South Africa, that labeled them terrorists. So right now, the resistance movement, again, we can disagree with tactics. The designation of terrorism is applied by the empire. We've got a question over here.
So here's the first thing that I always say to someone who say we need a Jewish state to keep us Jews safe is this is obvious, the most unsafe place in the world for a Jew to live right now is in Israel, or especially as a settler. I mean, not as unsafe as it is for the Palestinians, but compared to the United States or England or France, obviously, many more Jews are dying from violence there than anywhere else. So this idea of keeping us safe is, it's just false. It never has, and it never will. And one reason, it's obvious that it can't, and that's what people have to be told and understand. By the way, how you actually get through to people, I wish I knew. But one of the things to say is, if you had found a deserted island, somewhere, and said, okay, we've had it with the world. We're tired of all the anti-Semitism in the world. We're going to go establish ourselves there. I, by the way, would still be opposed to it. I don't like the idea of a Jewish state, even if there aren't any non-Jews in it, because eventually there will be, and I don't think it's fully democratic. But that's a more theoretical thing. We wouldn't be hearing about it. It wouldn't be an issue. Why is it an issue? Well, because they picked an area that was fully inhabited by an indigenous population that had been there for hundreds of years. In fact, I'm no historian, so take this with a grain of salt. My view is that indigenous Palestinian Arabs are probably much more likely to be the descendants of the ancient Judeans than I am. Right? I'm a Jew all of whose grandparents came from Eastern Europe. All right? So, in terms of who has a right to the land, there's no question. Okay? So if you impose yourself there, you're never going to have safety. That's the thing. You're never going to have safety. Now, the point is, you shouldn't have done that. There shouldn't have been a state there in the first place. You shouldn't have gone with a massive immigration movement to set up exclusivist institutions that discriminated against and oppressed Palestinians. But the point is, right now, there are 6 or 7 million Jews there. And they're not going to leave. They can't all leave. So now we have to find a way that everyone can be safe. But that way can't be a Jewish state. It just isn't, because it's going to be oppressive to Palestinians. So that's where I think this idea of binationalism can, again, at least with someone of goodwill, right, can address that a little bit, because the binationalists can say, look, first of all, you can have your Zionism be a cultural Zionism. You want to practice your Jewish life in the Holy Land? Okay, we'll facilitate that with various institutions that make that possible. But you cannot have sovereignty or coercive authority over everybody, not through those institutions. The institutions that do that would have to be the civic national institutions. But I don't know any other way to accommodate both Zionist and aspirations and fears other than that. The idea we have to have the coercive authority in our possession just doesn't work when you have other people who have a right to live there too. You just can't do that. And in the end, if people say, well, we're going to, well, that's when I don't know what to say to them anymore.
Great. I do want to, while we're taking questions, SJP working with FJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, Faculty for Justice in Palestine, have produced a lot of teach outs. So there's an overlapping one. We're going to continue this Q&A, but Coates is leading a zine zap right over here. So if you want to also join that, that's great. Oh. But you can also continue this conversation with Professor Joe Levine. Question here?
Thank you.
Yeah, one of the major planks of this One Democratic State campaign is to honor the right of return. Is everybody familiar with the phrase right of return? Okay, so again, this is about the Palestinians who were expelled during the 48 war. As estimates, again, about 750,000. And interestingly, many of them, thousands of them, of the Palestinians who were expelled, as soon as the war was over and the fighting stopped, started to come back. Because, well, yeah, why did they leave their homes? Because they were afraid, right? There was fighting. They left. When the fighting stopped, they thought, okay, we can come back. The United Nations passed a resolution that said they can come back. But the Israeli government passed a law immediately that said, no, they cannot come back. And indeed, over the course of the late 40s, early 50s, thousands of Palestinians were shot on sight. They were called infiltrators. That is, people trying to come back to their home were called infiltrators, and then were shot on sight. So, but ever since then, there have been, I forget the estimate now of how many millions of refugees and their descendants. Obviously, most of the people who were actually expelled in 48 are no longer alive, but their descendants are. Maybe some of you are descendants. And one of the main planks that the Palestinian movement, whether it's the PLO or others, has always been pushing is the right of return as part of any general overall solution of the conflict. So the One Democratic State campaign says, yes, there is a right of return. And the idea of the right of return is that anyone who either themselves were expelled or is a direct descendant of someone who was expelled has the right to come back. And of course, in the context of the One Democratic State campaign, this would be come back to this new state. Let's call it Palestine-Israel, just for short. Who knows what they would actually name it. They have the right to come back. Now, obviously, many, many Palestinians have made lives for themselves outside of Palestine and are not just going to uproot and go back. For them, there should be a choice. You can come back and be given certain resources to start your life here, or some compensation for the property lost. By the way, the property, not just the people were kicked out, the property that was taken over in 1948 by the Israeli government, the land and the houses and the orchards, and it was incredible how much that at that time was crucial economic infrastructure for the state of Israel, right? And all that was stolen from the people who left. And even some of the people that stayed, by the way, there was an absentee property law that said, even if you're inside the border, the now borders of Israel after 49, if you weren't in your home on certain dates, you count as what they called, only the Israelis could come up with this, a present absentee. Get that? In philosophy, we call that a contradiction. But you're present, but you're absent. And those people had no rights and lost their homes and lost their land. So anyway, that is what happened. The right of return is to say, okay, people can come back. They can't necessarily get their own homes back because over 500 villages were just completely razed to the ground. And any of you Jews here who as a kid gave dimes into those little, well, when I was a kid, they called them pushkas. Anyway, plant a tree in Israel. That was a big thing when I was a kid. You know, give your extra change for planting a tree in Israel. Well, what was the planting the trees for? To cover over all those villages that had been decimated. So yes, one question is, what are we going to do with the millions of Palestinians who are neither in the occupied territories or in Israel? And the One Democratic State campaign's idea is that we have to implement a right of return. And here's where the decolonization comes in, is that they also say part of that process of decolonization needs to be a redistribution of resources, right? There has to be sufficient land provided, homes, startup money. And one of the things that actually makes that really something that could actually work is that within the Arab world, I think this is well known, Palestinians are in many ways the most educated and developed socioeconomically in terms of ability to form these institutions. I mean, it's been really eye-opening when, you know, the horrible stuff you hear going on in the hospitals in Gaza. Don't want to go into details, but when you see the interviews and the descriptions of all of these really highly educated and skilled medical personnel that are throughout all these places, right? So this is a community that has many of the resources, at least the human capital, that's necessary to build a real life in this state. And what they need is material resources. And that at least is part of the official program of the One Democratic State campaign. Right now, you know, it's not a majority of people in favor of this, so, you know, but that at least is definitely taken into account.
Great. And I think future and present of Palestinians, and they're trying to kill it off. They're trying to, it's scholasticide. Learn about that, Scholars Against the War on Palestine. I think I saw it. You asked before, so if we could spread it out, yeah.
I was gonna go off of your question, because your question should be more towards the Jewish rights to return and how that would impact the racial struggles after.
Yeah.
No, I was referring to the Palestinian rights.
Yeah. Okay. I think we have maybe one question from the side here, and again, we should respect time. There is another.
What I was referring to is in the early period, the late 19th, early 20th century, up until, you know, maybe the 20s and 30s, or at least the 20s, there was a division in the Zionist movement between political Zionism and cultural Zionism. And cultural Zionism, which is basically disappeared. I mean, you don't hear about it now because they lost. But it was an idea that somehow Jewish, a certain kind of Jewish cultural and intellectual rebirth and rejuvenation was necessary and could best be accommodated within Palestine, within the Holy Land, but that it would not come with the institutions of a state and therefore not have coercive authority. Now, I'm not saying I belong to that cultural Zionist movement. I don't know why Jews can't be Jews wherever they are. In fact, one of the early Eastern European movements that was fighting the oppression of Jews in Eastern Europe, but that was very opposed to Zionism, was the Labor Bund, the Jewish Bund, B-U-N-D. People have heard of that. And they were very Jewish identified as Jewish culture. They spoke Yiddish. But their view, they actually had a doctrine. I'm trying to remember the Yiddish word. Some of you may remember. I think it was called Doikheit, which just meant here-ness. And what they meant by that was you fight for liberation where you are, where you have roots. You don't need to get your liberation by going somewhere else. This is where you fight for your liberation. So they believed in staying in Eastern Europe and fighting for liberation. Now, of course, after the Nazi Holocaust, the idea of Judaism and a movement in Eastern Europe just vanished because 95% of them were killed. But up until the Holocaust, that was a vibrant movement. Yeah, there is this idea, and what I was trying to say is it isn't about Jewish supremacy in the way political Zionism is. Still not, as I say, a movement that I myself would have supported, but certainly if their vision of Zionism had been implemented, we wouldn't be in the situation we are today.
Really putting Joe through the paces. Thank you all for being here. Really,
Yes,
I
thank
think
you.
Individual questions. Joe's such an intellectual powerhouse, so he can continue. But I think we should really join me. He doesn't look for applause, but I would applaud him. This was amazing. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Really, and thank you all for being here. Thank you for working with Students for Justice in Palestine, supporting Students for Justice in Palestine, and UMass dissenters to demilitarize and democratize our university. Wow, great.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you.